Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. We set out to study iconic songs, and you don't get much more iconic than Stairway to Heaven. It's a classic, and since it's by Led Zeppelin, you know there's gonna be some interesting stuff going on, but right away we run into a bit of a problem. We want to analyze the chords, but no one seems to be playing any. The song starts like this, and it's mostly just one note at a time. Where does the harmony come from? Well, fortunately they've hidden some chords here for us in the form of something called an arpeggio. This is where you play the notes of a chord, but you do it one at a time instead of all at once. There's still a harmonic progression behind what Jimmy Page is playing here, he's just outlining it with a melody, so in order to understand it, we're gonna have to simplify. Take the first four notes for instance. We've got an A, a C, an E, and then another A, which pretty clearly spells out an A minor triad. The next chord, though, isn't as simple. We've got a G sharp, a C, an E, and a B, and I've seen so many different opinions on what the actual chord here is. Personally, I think the best approach is to ignore the C and just call it an E major triad, and I'll explain why in a bit, but this one's ambiguous and you could certainly make the case for something else. The rest of it, though, is pretty simple. We have C major, D major, a full bar of F major 7, and then this thing, which is already chords. So now we know what he's playing, but there's another problem. Functionally speaking, this progression is gibberish. It's utterly incoherent. We can identify the chord functions, but they don't actually tell us anything about what's going on. Whatever it is, though, it's working, so how do we tease out that structure? Well, ironically enough, we have to go back to looking at single note lines. Each chord is played with 4 notes, so let's look at how each of those notes moves in between them. Let's start with the lowest note. Here's what it's doing in the first 5 chords. Yeah, that sounds important. It's sort of sliding down a half step at a time. This is what's called a line cliché, and it's pretty much what's holding this whole progression together. It provides the structure on top of which the rest of it is built. The top note, meanwhile, starts by moving in the opposite direction, but then on the 4th chord, it suddenly drops. And it doesn't just drop, it drops a tritone, an incredibly dissonant, attention-grabbing interval. Plus it drops to a note that isn't even in the key of A minor, which up to now it seemed like we were in. So yeah, that's why this chord stands out. After that it continues to drop, but much more smoothly this time, settling into the final chord without a lot of added fuss. And finally, let's look at the inner voices. They start like this, then go to this, then this, and no, I didn't mess up the audio clips, they actually play the exact same thing for the first 3 chords. This, by the way, is why I like to think of the second chord as an E major. The C is just suspended through it from the chords on either side. Add to that the fact that E major is a pretty important chord in the key of A minor, and I think the case is pretty strong. Anyway, after the first 3 chords, the inner voices drop down to here, then here, which doesn't really serve a hugely important purpose besides filling in the necessary notes to get the chords we want. After that, we have this section, which mostly serves to reset us to the beginning. After the second pass, though, the riff changes, which means we need to reduce it to chords again. The first 4 notes are clearly C major, then we have B major, F major 7, and then this. Here we've just got A's and B's, which doesn't really make a chord at all. Fortunately, by now there's some flutes, and they can fill in the rest. They're playing a C and an E, which together with our guitar notes tells us that this is probably an A minor, and the B's are just added notes that we can ignore. After that, we go back to C major, then G major, and finally D major. For this section, I think looking at lines is a little less useful. More important is the movement between the chords. For instance, the move from C major to D major is interesting because it's very uncomplicated. Everything moves up exactly the same amount. The move from D major to F major, on the other hand, is a lot more involved. This is what's called a chromatic mediant. Normally, triads whose roots are a third apart like D and F are would share 2 notes in common. They both have some kind of F and some kind of A, and you'd expect them to have the same versions of both, but in this case they can't agree on whether to use an F or an F sharp, which gives their relationship a close yet distant effect that can be really compelling. The motion from F major to A minor is fairly smooth though, since the chords can agree on which sort of A and C to use, which is good because the flute part is getting more complicated here, so we want to give it some room to shine. Then we get to these 3 chords, which are just major triads moving in ascending fifths. This is a powerful sound because it invokes dominant function, which is the primary driver of functional harmony. Of course, all the resolutions are backwards, so it doesn't quite feel right, but that's fine, we weren't all that functional anyway. After that, it repeats these 4 chords again, then finishes off with this, which, Yeah, that's just these 3 chords again, and it works the same way they did before, even if he's playing them a bit differently. Then the vocals kick in, and we go back to the top. Of course, Stairway's an 8-minute song, and it's got a lot of sections. The next big one is the chorus, where we switch to playing actual full chords, and while we're at it, we switch to yet another form of analysis, because this section is deeply modal. We've talked about modes before, but the important thing here is that they tend to have a very folk music-y sound to them, and this section is dominated by the movement from A minor to D major, which is an incredibly iconic sound in the mode known as Dorian. He plays a few other chords like this, but I tend to think that those are best viewed as embellishments. The whole section is really about these two. Then we get to the second verse and we're back to arpeggios, but with different chords this time. Here the progression's a lot simpler. We've got C major, G major, and A minor, and this section is almost functional. In the key of C major, it's the classic 1-5-1 progression, but with this bit replaced with what's called a deceptive resolution, where we go to a chord that's like C, but not quite C. Of course, we're not in C major, but if we viewed this as a sort of secondary dominant, I think it still works pretty well. They also sometimes include an F major 7 before the A minor, which accentuates the melody and contrasts with the Dorian sound of the chorus. These two sections repeat for a long time, then we get a largely rhythmic interlude, and finally we come to one of the most famous guitar solos ever recorded. It's incredibly intricate, but it's actually over some fairly simple harmony, which I think makes it all the more impressive. Specifically, the band is just playing these 3 chords over and over again, and it works again through descending bass motion. This simplicity means that the harmony isn't getting in the way, which leaves Jimmy Page free to do some absolutely incredible things. Then Robert Plant comes back in and sings over the same set of chords for a while, and then the song just ends. Suddenly. Anyway, thanks for watching, and thanks to Patreon patron Susan Jones for suggesting this song. If you'd like to see your favorite song analyzed, just head on over to Patreon and pledge at any level. You can also join our mailing list for scans of all our episodes. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and keep on rockin'.